Regards, and welcome to Ryan Rambles You To Rest, the podcast where I talk at length about matters of nearly no urgent need, nor heavy impact on our daily lives, in the interest of helping you there, off to a more peaceful state. For some reason, I associate the summertime with long periods peeling down the road. We seem to find ourselves most often with miles to drive in the warmer North American months. Truly, we do tend to tent up and camp down most preferentially when the environs of North America, and more specifically Northern California, are appreciably accommodating, away from elemental discomforts of the varieties cold or wet. Additionally, we find ourselves more likely to venture out to engage these activities among family and friends. Recently, we spent some very large amounts of time on the road, touring various parts of the USA. Very notably, we visited with family and congregated, for the most part, for a stretch in Rapid City, South Dakota, and the surrounding areas, then took an additional further journey on into Montana, and then into Wyoming to go to the Grand Yellowstone National Park. In this episode, I will engage in another Amiable Amble, a more compact modality which we tried out before. I will likely take the entire time talking about this or that on the road trip I was on recently. Before we begin, I would like to recommend that you subscribe to this show on your podcast platform of choice or YouTube. For news and announcements, follow us on Instagram at Ryan Rambles Pod. Our soundtrack is by Disparition. And so we are now here at the departure point of our smooth sojourn. Beyond this simple segue lies the semi-unknown. We are reminded of the famous tale of adventure, wherein one adventurer to the other inquired, "Where do these stairs go?" And in reply said the other, "They go up." Now, as far as we may go is to be determined, but I will take the time by starting at the start. Our particular tour of this tale took an entire week to unravel, and I should say that it is no understatement that much of this week was spent on the road, for, despite having a home base of operations for the first portion, we still averaged 200 miles per day across the entire experience. So buckle up your dream belts. We're on a slow drive into dreamland together. In an amiable amble, I begin with a thought, idea, or moment, or in this case an entire week of moments, that comes to mind when I begin the segment, and then I let that take us wherever it may. In this sense, an Amiable Amble could be the purest form of Ryan Rambles You to Rest, a sleep podcast. It may resemble at moments any of our other regular rambling segments, or perhaps otherwise extend our journeys into new territory. For now, we'll begin with Rapid City, South Dakota, which we arrived to via a brief layover in Denver. As you arrive at Rapid City Airport, it's easily to be a bit struck by the flatness of the terrain, and that is particularly in the eastward direction. This was my perhaps or likely second time in Rapid City in my life, but the first time I can't really remember for certain. I drove across the United States with my father when I was about 13, and I know that we went to the Badlands National Park and Wall Drug and Yellowstone later on, but I don't remember anything particularly about Rapid City. Now, the airport is somewhat remarkable. I would say I'm a bit of a fan of small airports because they're the least hassle and they still get you on a plane to somewhere. For a long time, I thought one of the best airports in the United States was Bob Hope Airport in Burbank. And in particular because on the occasion that I would have to fly down to Los Angeles, I didn't like going through LAX, and I think most people are the same. Similarly, you could say that LaGuardia is less a hassle than JFK and even Newark. But there's something nice about relatively small regional airports, especially when they're just large enough to feel like an airport. Usually they have a 2-floor airport, which is what makes it just a hair above that kind of middle of the nowhere feel. And that was the case with Rapid City. It's a 2-story, and I don't remember how many gates, but it couldn't have been much more than 3 or 4. And we got off the plane, and we were out of the terminal pretty quickly, but they did have a second-floor bar and restaurant there, which we didn't stop at. And then the baggage claim was a 2-strip baggage claim with the conveyor belt. And that was more or less the same room as the rental car section. You know, from where you were waiting for your bags, you could see the rental car desks. And then directly out the double doors from the rental car desk were the rental cars themselves. And I think we paused for a selfie in front of a "Welcome to South Dakota" sign and breezed our way through the rental car pickup. Another nice thing about smaller airports, that you don't have to wait an hour to get your car. And here, in fact, is where we acquired our vehicle that would be central to our lives for the next 7 or 8 days. This was a Kia Telluride, which feels a little large, and then not over large. It feels medium large, and then it's also quite long because it has an extra row of seats in the back before you get to the trunk, or it can have a giant trunk. So we picked that up, and that was our main vehicle. Pretty comfortable to drive, I'll be honest. I can say that after so many thousands of miles. And we just had a bit of time to kill before more family came into Rapid City. So we were also extremely hungry. And we drove down into the downtown area to explore a little bit. Our first choice was to go to a ramen place. It was called Bokujo Ramen, and it seemed to pop up on a few different Reddit threads and articles and so on and so forth. I spent my time in the brief flight from Denver to Rapid City looking on the internet for different food places because we knew we were going to be hungry. I hadn't really eaten that day. I had intended to get a sandwich in Denver. But then the sandwich place that I wanted to go to in Denver was on the other side of the airport, and we discovered down a series of winding hallways in the Frontier Terminal, rather than in one of the multiple ample food court areas in the Denver airport. If you ever happen to go to the Denver airport, it is very mall-like at its hub spots. And I mean that in a good way when it comes to the food, because there's plenty of room for multiple restaurants and lots of options. So we were hungry. I was extra hungry. And we attempted to go to the ramen place, but they were closed for the middle of the day, the in-between lunch and dinner. So we went to a tap room that had some okay flatbread and some local beer, and that was nice. And we wandered around downtown Rapid City. And downtown Rapid City has an interesting quirk, perhaps several, but one notable quirk of downtown Rapid City is that they have a statue of a president on every street corner. I don't think it's on 4 corners of every intersection, but each intersection has, at the very least, one president. And it's my understanding that they have most of the presidents up through, I believe, Barack Obama. So as we wandered around, we would come upon another statue and at a distance try to guess who the president was. I'm not an expert on U.S. presidents, but it was still fun. We took pictures with a few of them. Jimmy Carter had his hand in the air, so I pretended to high-five him. But downtown Rapid City is actually pretty nice. It's a nice walkable area. We discovered that there were at least 3 or 4 different game and hobby stores, which we like. Each one had its own kind of angle. One hobby store was all models and RC cars and things like that. And then there was another one that was a comics and board game store. And then there was another one that was sort of focused on retro gaming and with a little bit of tabletop, like some Warhammer and Magic the Gathering, if you're familiar with those sorts of things. It's generally not necessary anymore if you want to play an old video game to go and find a cartridge of it, but I do think it's still fun to go look at shelves of cartridges of old games and think about buying them. I still retain a handful of original consoles from over the years, and I have some of the more recent ones hooked up to my TV in case I want to play an old game. I think the oldest one I have hooked up is the original Nintendo 64. So nothing older than that, but I do have a couple of different emulators, and that's really the main mode. The file sizes are so small for those games that you can have thousands of them in one handheld device, which is pretty incredible. In fact, I had one such handheld device with me on this trip, but I ended up never taking it out, in part probably because I was behind the wheel so much of the time. Had I not been behind the wheel so much, perhaps I would have taken a few minutes here or there to play an old video game from the last century. As I was saying, downtown Rapid City was delightful, and after some walking around, we went and found the Airbnb that the family had gotten, and took advantage of the opportunity to pick out a room and get the lay of the land. This was a pretty neat rental. It had an indoor pool with a water slide, which you don't see very often. I could see perhaps why someone would have an indoor pool in Rapid City, as in a few places we noticed there was a lot of sort of particulate matter in the air, like from trees and things, that I could imagine that if that was pervasive enough and there's enough wind and so on, that you'd find yourself having to clean that water pretty often. So indoor makes sense. Large Airbnbs are kind of fun to get with the family because there's always it's like a new house to explore, and they're always so big, and they have all kinds of neat different features. We usually get a place with a pool, if not more than one pool. This one had a pool and a double wide hot tub. And it had a game room downstairs with air hockey. And it had a pretty big kitchen area. And something we didn't discover until the very last day was that we were able to walk up the hill behind the house. And this house was, I guess, sort of backed up against the Black Hills of South Dakota. Like as it begins to get into that rockier mountain territory. And we discovered that the back of the house was basically at the end of a canyon, But we didn't realize it until we had walked up on the upper lip of the canyon and looked down and realized there was this whole ravine from the back. And it separated us from another property across the way where there were some fellas doing construction. So we were still waiting for the family to show up and decided that we could head out, maybe do some food shopping, but while we were out, take advantage of going back to the ramen place, which would now be open for dinner. In between going the first time and not getting in, and going the second time, I read a little bit more about that restaurant, and it turned out that it was a restaurant owned by Justin Warner, who is a pretty famous chef if you follow the Food Network. He's a regular face in some of the Guy Fieri programming. He's often on Guy's Grocery Games, and he's a what do they call them? Like a food ambassador. I might be wrong about that. On Tournament of Champions. His role is to make note of what the competing chefs are making, so that when it comes time for the judges to do the blind taste testing, someone is able to explain to them what the dish is without the chef being present. And he's a fun personality. And this was his restaurant, which is an interesting sort of fusion of Japanese-style foods with Midwest local ingredients. And he was there, and I was too shy to say hello or introduce myself to him. But he was there, and that was exciting. And I got a bison ramen. And it was a bison. There was some bison meat, and then there was a bone broth, bison bone broth, and then some of the accoutrements were, I think, pine nuts and I want to say arugula or spinach. It was an interesting combination. It definitely felt like a version of ramen that was considerate of local ingredients and local flavors, and it was very good. We also got just a small plate of pickled cucumber that was a little spicy and a little nutty. Maybe there was a sesame or peanut factor there. Those were both very good things. And I had a ruminate soda, those sodas that have the marble in the middle. I saw them on the menu, and I had recently watched Shoplifters, the movie that won the Palme d'Or a few years ago, related to a movie league that I'm in, where we select a movie a month to watch and talk about. And that movie had this soda in it, and it made me think to order it, and I had one. And I recommend it. It's a fun soda to have. I think I had the orange flavor, and it was delightful. It went very well with the ramen. So props to Chef Justin Warner and his wife for their lovely restaurant, Bokujo Ramen in Rapid City. Now, of course, we drove around a lot, as I said, and we really spread out around Rapid City. Our first day out and about, we went to Mount Rushmore. Now, I had been there when I was younger, and that I remember, and I didn't think it was very spectacular when I was a kid. Sort of a lot smaller than you think it's going to be if you've seen it in movies like North by Northwest. But this time I enjoyed it a bit more. The road up there is comically peppered with tourist traps, and as tourist trappy as you can get. Giant candy stores, horseback riding, even some roller coasters. All variety of amusement with different themes and concepts, not all of them themed to South Dakota or Mount Rushmore. But every kind of thing that can be on a billboard and distracting and sort of keeping you away from making it up to Mount Rushmore. And then you get up there and there's a big parking structure to go in. And then, really it's just a long walkway out to a view of a mountain with these big carvings in it. I don't know to what extent there was a very big exhibit there when I was younger. I don't know about that, but as I've gotten older, I appreciate more museum-type stuff and history-type stuff, and I like to read about things and how things are done and see all of the old photographs of people doing the carving and all that, and so on and so forth. And Mount Rushmore certainly has plenty of that. And our weather was beautiful, so there was nothing to complain about, really. Something fun that they have to eat at Mount Rushmore is a vanilla ice cream that is purportedly the ice cream recipe, which I think they say was written down by Thomas Jefferson. And you can buy like postcard versions of the recipe. And then what they sell at the ice cream shop is said to be based on that recipe. And I didn't read the recipe to find out what would be different. I suspect that all this time later, there's probably a few ingredients that are either illegal today or didn't exist back then for the sake of, preserves or who knows what. But I will say it is one of the better vanilla ice creams I've had, if you're into vanilla ice cream. A lot of people feel that it's too plain. I myself rather enjoy vanilla ice cream. It doesn't have very many bells and whistles, which also means that there isn't very much to hide behind in terms of quality. We also stopped in at the gift shop. There aren't many things that I am in the habit of collecting, but one thing I've gotten into the habit of collecting is from national parks and national monuments and so on. There's a trend of magnet that resembles a benchmark. I think the first time we might have encountered it was at the Grand Canyon or Bryce Canyon, I forget which, and I thought it was a neat design for a magnet, just a metal disc with this sense of official information printed on it. And they also include the elevation of where they are, and I like that too. It's hard to say what the elevation is measured to, whether that's a particular spot in the park or who knows, but it's still the ballpark of elevation, and I like that. Especially when you consider that a lot of the Midwest in the U.S., even though it looks flat, is actually very high in elevation. So we got one of those benchmarks, and there were some local cheeses, and we got some cheese curds, I think, that were maybe blueberry. They were blueberry cheese curds. Maybe there was a spice to it too, like so it's like sweet and spicy, like jalapeno blueberry. I can't recall. If I can figure it out, I'll update anybody who's interested. But it was weird. But it was also tasty. Now then, we decided that one of the conversations that we had in the days leading up to this trip amongst the family was how ambitious we were going to be with national parks and monuments, because this region has quite a few. And so on this first day, we decided that we would try to include Wind Cave National Park, which is further south from Mount Rushmore. So we headed out on the road after our ice cream at Mount Rushmore and headed south. South of Mount Rushmore takes you through some very beautiful windy mountain roads. Just north of the town of Custer, you come across Crazy Horse, which is the mountain that they're trying to carve a giant statue of the Native American Crazy Horse. It's been going on since, I think, mid-last century, and they've managed to carve out the head and a hand that he's pointing with, and I think the arm of that hand, and part of his horse's head, which doesn't seem like very much when you consider that Mount Rushmore took a much smaller amount of time to create. But the Crazy Horse effort is a private effort. I don't know exactly how the funding works, but it's not a national monument. You pay to visit it. Perhaps we'll go a little bit more in depth on that, because we did eventually go there. But not at this time. At this time, we drove past Crazy Horse, and I was able to see Crazy Horse's head in my side view mirror as we passed by and headed on through the town of Custer. Now, we didn't stop in Custer, but from my airplane research prior, I believe that there are a few restaurants that do come highly recommended there. Cannot personally recommend them, but just so you know, if you happen through there, consider Custer for a stop. So, Wind Cave National Park, it's the, I think, 8th national park out of 63, so it was pretty early on. And It's an interesting park because it's sort of two parks in one. There are, or is, the Wind Cave that the park is named after. And then there is the land on top of where the cave is. And having driven from Rushmore to Wind Cave, we rolled up thinking we can check out the caves. And instead, it turned out that to be able to tour the cave, you either need to have tickets that you purchased very far in advance, at least a week in advance, but 2 or more. So not as crazy as reserving, say, a camp spot at a national park 6 months out, but still not the easiest to get. There are many tours a day, and you just need to come early in the day before they open to get in line, which we hadn't done because by the time we got through Rushmore and all the way down there, it was the afternoon, and the cave tours were all sold out. So instead, we opted to drive around a bit above ground because we had heard about the bison, and at this point in our journey hadn't seen any, or if we had, we might have seen one in the distance. So we got in the car, and I had asked the ranger some questions, both about getting tickets for Wind Cave and then also if they knew where the bison were. And they had given a hint that there was some part of the park on the other side where there was a mother and some children to see. And so we headed on our way to drive out there. Now, what's interesting is that at Wind Cave National Park, as distinct from some of the other places we visited, there is an enormous population of prairie dogs. The prairie dogs are kind of everywhere. You're driving down the road and it might even look like the road is moving and you realize it's prairie dogs. And they're all along the side of the road and going up a hill and going down a hill and going in every possible direction. And just like you may have seen in photographs, they are standing up. There's always a few of them that are standing up on the lookout for danger, which is something comical to behold because it never seems like they're very much in danger when you're seeing them. They're just hanging out, grabbing food, and here's one here, or here's one there that's standing up, looking around, and they look just kind of funny. And they're also only about, I'm not sure, but let's say, 12 inches tall or something. And you see so many of them that I had this weird experience that when I was driving outside of Wind Cave, just about anything off the side of the road that was about that height and width I thought was a prairie dog for a moment, because you just become so accustomed to constantly seeing them. So we were a bit off the beaten path. We drove around a few bends and turns and so on and so forth. And we came to a road that became unpaved. And we took that a bit further, and as we were going, we saw in the not too far distance, there was like a hiking trailhead, but then there was this almost sudden herd of bison that were walking along past the trailhead and heading on their way up over the hill. It's mostly open land, not a lot of trees, like a few sparse trees here and there, and it was warm out, and there were enough trees around that they might have somewhere to congregate in the shade. And as we were sitting there, we come to realize that this may be the group, the herd that the mother was a part of, because we see suddenly this one smaller buffalo running around. And, bison are very sort of stoic and slow-moving, meandering, if you will, creatures, and it's quite the sharp contrast to see one running around. And this little one that had the zoomies was, you could imagine, maybe even irritating the adult bison who were just plodding slowly up the hillside. And the little one kept bouncing around and up and down and running around Mama until eventually Mama acquiesced and bounced around and ran around a little bit with the little one. And it was absolutely adorable. And one of the most heartwarming things I think I've ever seen in nature. They didn't play for very long. Eventually they just kind of got back on their way, heading up the hill. And then we pulled up to where the trailhead was. There was a little parking, and there was another SUV parked there. And we got out to watch the bison as they moved away up the hillside. And because all of us, I don't know if we had seen many in our lifetimes. We have a small herd of bison here in San Francisco, in Golden Gate Park. And we see those bison pretty regularly, as we live close to that park. But we don't see them more or less in nature. These are confined to this national park. And Wind Cave National Park's area isn't very big. You could drive all the way around it in a, reasonably short period of time. But it was still something to behold. And while we were watching them, the owners of the SUV came along, a couple with their dog, and they had walked their dog off in the other direction. And when they came up upon where we were in the parking lot, this just maybe 20 square foot gravel spot, they were chuckling and laughing, and we come to realize that their silverish SUV. It looks like it's been buffed with like a sandy rag all the way around. And it turns out that before we had gotten there, the herd of buffalo had come through, and a number of them had apparently just rubbed up on the car a whole bunch. And it looked like it. So that was rather amusing. And then that couple left, and we watched the bison a little longer. And then after that we drove more along the ridge. This was getting into slightly higher ground. We saw some birds, and I believe perhaps some form of antelope. I don't think they were elk because they were a bit smaller. And there was this fence on one side because the northern part of Wind Cave National Park actually borders on Custer State Park. And there is kind of a difference between these two. We drove from this northern point after we were satisfied at having seen the bison back to the Airbnb, and we took the road through the state park. And interestingly, the Google directions took us almost the entire way through windy back roads. Sort of gives you this idea that as the Black Hills begin west of Rapid City or at Rapid City, that the width of Rapid City is, a few miles, and this park, Wind Cave, is about the same width because the road that borders the east side of Rapid City is on the east side of the park, and the road that goes on the west side of Rapid City and down through Rushmore is on the west side of the park. I could be almost completely wrong about this dimension-wise, but we were between those two main roads almost our entire drive back, and I feel like the Google directions would probably not have taken us through this rural landscape if it was certainly faster for us to drive out to the freeways. And mind you, that out here in South Dakota, the speed limit is higher than it is near us in other urban areas where it's 70 to 80 miles per hour. So the following morning, we got up at the crack of dawn. Not quite the crack of dawn. The sun was up, and we were probably close to the solstice, I think. I think also it's interesting for all the things that can be different when you travel. From weather and climate and altitude and everything, humidity, all these things that are different. And the differences I tend to take for granted that they will be different from home. But I always find sunrise and sunset being different to be the most jarring difference. Just the length of the day itself, when it begins and when it ends. It somehow just doesn't factor into my expectation. The air is going to be different. You expect that. The bed is going to be different because you're in a strange bed. The food is going to be different because it's a different culture. But some combination of where we delineate time zones and then general latitude on the planet lends to sunrise and sunset times that are just different enough that it throws off what feels like should be the rest of the normal day. For example, when we were in France a couple years ago and went to Mont Saint-Michel, I thought we would have an enjoyable romantic sunset there. Now, COVID got in the way of that romantic sunset, but I was able to go and see the sunset, and the sun sets there over a sandy flats that lead out to the ocean when the tide is out, and you're on this castle slash church monastery type thing. But the sunset time, I want to say, wasn't until something like 10:30 p.m. And so it was even light-ish after 11 and on towards midnight. Now, this wasn't the case in South Dakota, but I bring it up because the plan was to get up so early that we could be to Wind Cave to get same-day tour tickets by 7 or 7:30 a.m. ahead of them opening at 8 a.m. And from where we were staying, it was about a 90-minute drive. So that meant leaving in the neighborhood of 6 in the morning and being up before that. And so when we got up to get going, between 5 and 6 a.m., somewhere in there, it was actually already getting sunny outside. And that really threw me off. I had imagined that we would get up in the dark of night and hit the road, and hopefully there would be like a coffee shop we might be able to stop at. But instead it looked totally normal and was pretty light out by the time we were really getting out to the main road to take us south to Wind Cave. When we pulled into the parking lot at Wind Cave at the visitor center, it wasn't too crowded. And I had been warned by the rangers that it was possible, if not likely, for it to be pretty packed with a long line out the door and partway down the sidewalk. In fact, they have stanchions on the sidewalk to keep the line in one place. But when we got there, it wasn't too crowded. And this was around 7:30. But there were some diehards. The ranger had promised me. And there was several people. Those at the front had camping chairs and were just sitting there waiting for the doors to open. Totally relaxed. And then there was another 15-odd people after that were milling about, standing in line. And we got there, got out of our vehicle, and stood there. While we were standing there, a truck rolled up with a smoker in tow, like a grill with a smoker of some kind. And a gentleman and a woman got out of this vehicle and they proceeded across the other side of the parking lot to erect a pop-up tent and offload their smoker and a number of coolers and folding tables. And the people standing next to us had commented that it would be very smart for somebody to set up some kind of shop here, knowing that reliably every day there would be a line of people at around 8 in the morning. And I had said something similar like this to my partner. So, to see it unfold before our very eyes was a somewhat amusing moment, and I should say, very welcome. Because after they had gotten largely unpacked and gotten things fired up, they parked the truck, and then the fella walked across the street of the parking lot. There's a little island, and he got about to the island, and he made an announcement. He said that they were going to be selling hot dogs and sausages and coffee. And maybe there were some other things in that announcement, but I have a generally one-track mind. In the morning I want coffee, and just about any time of day a tubed meat is welcome. And he had a Wagyu beef sausage of some kind, a bison sausage, and something else, maybe an elk, I don't know. Well, we got coffee for starters and waited in line, and a little while later, one of the rangers came out, and the ranger explained how this was going to go down, that everyone should be friendly and orderly, and when the visitor center opens, we are to walk straight through the building to the back of the building and to the desk in the back where the ticket sales will be handled one person at a time. Then, after they opened the doors and we all went in, we had to decide what tour we wanted. Of the 3 options, there was a very accessible tour, there was a minimally strenuous tour that was called the Natural Entrance Tour. And for context, the natural entrance to the cave is actually only about the size of a basketball or a football of the European variety. The cave itself was opened by miners in the 1800s. And then there was a third tour that was considered the most strenuous because there's one point where you climb a number of consecutive stairs before descending back to the beginning, and you take an elevator both ways. But we opted for the more strenuous one, and it was starting relatively soon, so we wouldn't be getting our tickets and then having to wait several hours. We had about half an hour to get ready. And by get ready, I mean go back to that fella and get a bison dog. So I had the bison dog. It was fine. It was pretty good. Very thankful that that person was there. He was very, very friendly and seemed proud of his work. And I applaud that fella. And I should say at this time also all of the park staff who were super helpful in every way. Those at the counter, the rangers, the folks in the shop, the gift shop, where I, of course, having gone the second day and would be doing the cave tour, went ahead and acquired the necessary benchmark magnet. And so we headed on down to embark on our tour. And there was this, after a walk away from the visitor center, a bit downhill, there's a small building where we waited for a little while until our tour guide came. And our tour guide was a master's student on a summer internship, whose name I don't recall, but I think we were instructed to say, "Hey, tall girl," if we forgot her name. So, Hey, tall girl introduced herself and had us introduce ourselves, and we were to see who came from the furthest. And I believe we determined that my partner and I had come the furthest from California, although there were two gentlemen coming from Chicago who had accents that were not of Chicago, and made me think that maybe they drove from Chicago, but in terms of where they're from, much further away than San Francisco. So we went in, and there's a just perfectly normal elevator, and the ranger took us in groups of about 8 down the shaft, or maybe 40 of us, so it was about 4 or 5 trips, and we congregated in this room at the bottom that was closed in with a glass door, and we learned that it worked as sort of an airlock system, which is because the wind cave, there was the entrance I had told you about that was about the size of a football from Europe. It breathes in and out depending on the difference in air pressure between the interior of the cave and the exterior. So the subterranean entrance to the cave has a blocking door so that the air pressure isn't disturbed on the inside when people are entering the cave. So then we all got moving on the tour, and we were right behind the ranger, who walked very slowly. And about 3 or 4 minutes in, we hit a fork in the cave, and the ranger had us plug that fork. The two of us stood in the tunnel way to keep the rest of the party moving in the direction the ranger went. So we started next to the ranger and then kind of moved all the way to the back, where there was what was known as, or who were known as, the caboose. And the caboose was a group of 4 folks that were gifted a flashlight for the tour and there to hold up the rear. So we were with them for a little while, and they recommended to us that while we were on this experience, this vacation, that we go to Devil's Tower. And I will admit that I didn't really know what that was. Or, I did in some way, but I didn't know what it was when they first brought it up. And one of the women said, you should go see it because it's an unusual stone mountain, and because it was in Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Steven Spielberg. Well, that being one of my favorite movies, I definitely wanted to go see that. And I decided I would look into it later, which I did, and it turned out that it was not close to where we were in South Dakota. But there was a good chance we might be able to visit Devil's Tower on our way out to Yellowstone. Now, back in the cave. This was an especially interesting cave. From what we heard from Hey Tall Girl was that Wind Cave is the third largest cave system in the United States, behind Mammoth and Jewel Cave. Jewel Cave being about a 30 to 40 minute drive from Wind Cave. And I think she said that made Wind Cave somewhere in the top 10 in the world. And apparently what is unusual or unique about Wind Cave is that it's quite vertical. It's a cave system that goes down, as the area that the cave covers is only about a square mile from looking down, but it goes down. And they say if they were able to do a lot more exploring, that they would probably determine that it was larger than one or both of the other two caves. But because they've long had a policy to not use explosives and excavate, they haven't been able to fully explore the system. Although they do have volunteers who come in from time to time that will map out more of the cave. Now, the tours that you can take today through Wind Cave are actually quite easy to do. They're completely paved. There are handrails when the stairs are slippery spots. And the whole thing is very well lit. And what's interesting about it is the history to the point where it became a national park. There were two families that were running Wind Cave after it was determined that there was no gold there during the gold rush, as there was a gold rush in this region, noting that this isn't very far from Deadwood, which is famous as an HBO television series. Now, Wind Cave turned out to not have any gold in it, but it did have Wind Cave. So there's an interesting history that the native people regarded Wind Cave as a sacred place that was where their people had lived underground while the powers that be were creating the surface of the earth, and that there was someone that came and tempted some of the people out of the cave. And when they came out of the cave, they discovered that they weren't ready to survive in the new world, where it was cold and difficult. And then when God, or the primary deity of the story, discovered that they had come out, was unhappy with them for disregarding the recommendation to stay in the cave until things were finished, and wanted to punish them, but also was somewhat benevolent about it, and gave them very thick coats to keep them warm, and horns to protect themselves. And so those early native people became the bison of the region, which is an interesting story. But what directly impacts the experience of going there today is that the two families that took it over after the mining was not a thing turned it into a tourist destination in the early 1900s. And one family ran the cave, and the other family ran the hotel. And they had a dispute over ownership, and eventually the government decided that the cave belonged to the United States and took it away. However, the son of the cave people, from the age of about 16 until the age of about 20, was an avid explorer of the cave and would go in there by himself for days at a time, and actually carefully mapped out much of the cave that was accessible, that had been, there was parts that had been blasted by miners and so on. But this fella mapped out most of the cave, at least the parts of it that you'll get a tour of if you go there. And then he and his father went to the World's Fair in, I don't remember which year, but it's believed that his health was probably impacted by exploring the cave, and he contracted a typhoid fever and passed away. But when the national parks took it over, they had all of his notes. And so they went in and explored the cave and made it possible to have more tours there with all of the cement and railings and so on. But a lot of the chambers along the tour still bear the names that this kid gave them 100 or more years ago, which I think is very fascinating. And then the cave itself is somewhat unusual. Its type of formation is different from a lot of other caves. It doesn't have stalactites and stalagmites. Its formation was, I want to say there was maybe some earthquakes or something that sort of opened the cave up more. And the ground was formed by different hardnesses of rock. And after the earthquakes occurred and the cave opened up more vertically, water was able to rush in and essentially erode away the softer rocks. And as those softer rocks fell away or dissipated, the harder rock was basically like honeycombed, and where it had formed amid the softer rock. And as a result, the ceilings of Wind Cave look like they're from a science fiction movie. They look like an alien hive. They have almost an organic looking quality to them, and it's really unusual and very interesting. And then there are also some other subterranean formations that make it look like there's snow. So the tour was very interesting. We learned that there wasn't any wildlife in there. There's just an uninhabitable cave, basically. Except for, I believe there are microbes that they have found in the water at the lowest levels of the cave. And apparently those are being studied out of interest into how they can survive down there without much in the way of nutrients or any sunlight. So I recommend Wind Cave. It's an exciting place. You take an elevator up and down, and at the bottom the elevator has those old-timey floor dials that like sort of semicircle that show what floor the elevator is at, which are functional because even though the rest of everything looks so modern, these elevator things are old, and apparently they are 90-year-old original elevator shaft dials that are still working today. I'm not a very experienced cave person, but I will say Wind Cave is worth checking out. After Wind Cave, we went to Custer. We stopped there for gas and a brief air-conditioned nap in the car. And then we met up with more family at Crazy Horse. And Crazy Horse is an interesting place. It doesn't feel like a national park because it has a for-profit quality. You drive in and there's this long, grand road up to the visitor center, and the whole time you're looking at the mountain. And you get up there to the parking lot, and the visitor center is pretty vast. It has a theater in it. It has a sort of museum of a few rooms with lots of different items and artifacts collected over time. There is a gift shop, and there's a lot of sort of attached buildings and things. It's an interesting project in that they started it in the middle of the last century and had this vision of creating not just the statue out of the mountain itself, but that the surrounding area would be something that thrived as well, of having a medical school, a university, an airport, and I think some other features that I'm clearly forgetting. And not all of it was successfully built. I think the medical center did not exist, but I think the university might be there. We mainly met up there to go to lunch, and we ate at the cafeteria, where they had a few items on the menu that were authentic Lakotan recipes. There was fry bread, there was a stew, and there was also a dessert, like berry syrup or jam, somewhere in the middle. That was actually quite delicious. The stew was pretty good. The fry bread was actually quite good, to be honest. And then the The museum itself is kind of interesting. It's not especially curated. There's sort of areas, but it seems mainly an accumulation of items that have some explanation connected to them. A little bit about the history of Crazy Horse, and then ongoing efforts to try to fund the place and the excavation of the mountain. I think they discovered that the quality of the rock in the mountain wasn't what they had hoped it would be, so that it's sort of changing their plans, and that they may not create the whole statue, but they're aiming to have a sort of version of it done in the next 10 years or so. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And it was good to have that food. There were oddly few opportunities to find the Native American food during this trip. And at one point later on, we do drive through a reservation, but we didn't do much research in advance or have much time to stop. But I would say that I didn't see with my eyeballs many opportunities to stop off and try some of the local foods. After Crazy Horse, we took a little bit of a detour up to a KOA resort. I didn't know if I had seen a KOA resort before. It was full of different buildings and things to do, and the thing to do that we were there for was a little end-of-day horseback ride around the edge of the property, and that was nice. We got to see some nice mountain views and some woods on what I would say is probably the most tame horseback ride I've had, of the 3 total I've had. However, this was the end of the day, and my horse was a little bit uncooperative. We were on sort of a corral route for the first 20 minutes, and then that opened up into the pasture that the horses spend the night in. And my horse just decided it was time to walk off into the middle of the field and check out the marmots that were hanging out there. And it did not want to go back to the group, so I needed a little bit of help. And I had a ranch hand there that guided my horse for the rest of the horseback riding. But it was still very enjoyable. Not quite a sunset tour, but very nice. And a good, relaxing sort of end to the day. Because the next day we would be going to the Badlands. And I think this is a good place to pause our Ramblin USA. Obviously, there's more to the road trip, and always more to the road. So we'll return to get back to the rest of Rapid City and the Badlands, and then to move on, I hope. Have you been to these national parks and monuments? What is your favorite thing about them? Let me know. And so this will conclude our amiable episode Ramblin USA. I want to thank you all, dear resters, for joining us on these visits together. I hope as well that you have been adequately rambled to rest and are not hearing what I am saying right now. However, if for some reason you are conscious at this time, I will leave you with these parting words. Correct. Ambiguous. Tame. Rate. Fast. Mint. Wall. Chance. Gorgeous. And trick. Thank you again. I am your host, Ryan. Music has been by Disparition. And until we meet again, may your days be stress-free and your night be restful.